You heard the reading from John. For me, when I read it this week, yet again, it reminded me that it was about this time a few years ago when the young man knocked on my door. I think he must have walked some 3 miles or so to my doorstep by himself that cold afternoon in New Jersey. When I saw him, I was worried because this young man was autistic and he had a number of other challenges. And here he was by himself on my doorstep, knocking on the door, wanting entry. But I don't mention that to have his challenges define him, because he had many amazing abilities. He had one of the best memories I've ever seen in another human being, and he was a savant with dates. And the great thing about him, and the thing that I wish that I possessed that he had, was he had the ability to remember your name, everybody's name, and he always remembered your birthday. He was so kind and so affectionate, and he loved his church. He had piercing blue eyes. He always had a smile on his face. Except for today. I opened the door and he immediately handed me his portable video game machine. "It's broken, Pastor Sam. Can you fix it?" He was really intent on that machine, but something told me he had not visited to deal with broken video games. For you see, his father had been admitted to the emergency room about a week before, and the doctors had quickly discovered that the father's cancer had returned, a cancer linked to his service in Vietnam and exposure to Agent Orange. And over my several visits to the hospital that week, I had prayed with the family, and I told the young man, his son, that we were there for him and we would help him in any way that we could. And here he was today on my doorstep to collect on the promise I reckoned. So I invited him in. He sat down at our kitchen table. He pointed out the video game machine again. Urgently, I needed to fix it. So I took a look at the machine. I like to tinker with things. And I just figured it needed new batteries. So I fixed it, and I handed the fixed machine back to him, and he thanked me. And then we sat there. And then we sat some more in silence. As you've already figured out, he wasn't there to get the machine fixed. He was there because he needed to be with someone. Amidst all the inner turmoil and anxiety going on inside of him, all these emotions that he had always had a hard time processing, what he needed was a friend, and I was honored that he had chosen me. Honored, but also disarmed at his silence. For you see, preachers are no good at being quiet. We live and die by our words, but he didn't want my words. He didn't want my consolation. He didn't want the usual lines I give families in time of crises that all will be well. He really didn't want to hear another person say that we'll be praying for you when you're dead. He wanted presence. He wanted the one thing that ought to scare the socks off each of us, because it's the one thing that we are the quickest to withhold. We're afraid of what just being present requires. We don't want to be vulnerable. We don't want others to see us as we are in the awkward silence that pain always brings. And yet we sat there, the now repaired machine sitting unused in his hands. Time crept by slowly until he broke the silence. Pastor Sam, do you think my dad will be okay? I smiled and realized I better not start lying now. I told him I don't know. I'm not God. But I hoped that his dad would get better. And I told him I was so happy he had come to visit me and he was welcome at my home anytime. And to this day, and only from time to time, he still calls me. Though hundreds of miles separate us, he wants to know if my kids are doing well. He adores my wife and always wants me to tell her that he said hello. Presence. Despite all the issues that young man faced that day, he was in his very being honest in a way that we usually are not. He wanted no facade, no pretense. His was an expression of something universal in each of us, true of our deepest longing. At the heart of our soul's cry is the hope that there might be one who would be present with us when pain comes and the sea billows roll, as that old song says. The young man, we may not know how to verbally express our deepest need. Sometimes we're all so mixed up inside that the soul's cry is left mute. We may not possess the wherewithal to adequately diagnose what we want, but the great news is that we belong to one who knows us better than we know ourselves, to one who is closer to us than we are to ourselves. And to this deep need, the Gospel of John tells us, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Actually, that's a bad translation, and that's why I had Dave correct it in his reading. It isn't dwell with us. John actually writes, and the Word became flesh and tabernacled. The Word became flesh and camped out. The Word became flesh and took up residence among us. Hearkening back to the image of the children of Israel in the wilderness who had just fled the comforts and the terrors of Egypt, John tells us that he had come to tabernacle with us, housing the presence of God. That tabernacle, which was the true sign and presence of God with the people in the midst of their uncertainty. The tabernacle where even Moses would meet with God as with a friend. John tells us that God, the Word, tabernacled with us, took up residence, dwelt with us, came to town, got an address, moved in next door, took up our plight, next to us, with us, presence. Distance overcome, God and humanity one. Pastor Sam, do you think my dad will be okay? He lives in and with and through and beside and over and around and next to us as we ask our questions, will it be okay? And we slowly learn that we no longer need to fear the dark, for he has overcome it. Never again, John tells us, will the darkness prevail. This is what God has done for us, and we have seen his glory, and it is full of grace and truth. In him is life. In him is life. Run to him today, for he has already run towards you. Run to him, and you will never, ever be alone.